Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. And this is our final lecture. We've week 13, and we're nearing the complete end as you are completing your term paper assignment. I hope that is going well. I've heard from some of you, and sounds like some very interesting ideas are being developed, and I'm looking forward to reading your term papers that will be due at the end of the review week. Now, before we get into the substance of today, let me remind you of this message that came from the Academic Regulations and Records Office. Okay, and please take note of this because the deadline is today. This regarding the examinations and taking examinations online off campus. So this is now available, as they indicate here, to all students. You have the option of taking the final exam online off campus. If you wish to do so, if you wish to apply for taking the examination off campus, you have to submit a request via Ames. Now, I sent this to you on Canvas as an announcement, and I expect you have read this already, but just to remind you. Also, if any of you are from the Elder Academy taking the course and you'd like to do the exam too, you're welcome to do so. And but you also should follow the same procedure. All right. Please submit a request via Ames and request for taking the examination online off campus. Today is the deadline. All right. So please don't miss it. It says very strictly, late submission will not be accepted. So please take note. And if you had communicated with me earlier, because prior to this announcement, it was supposed to be you contact the course leader and so forth. This has changed now with this announcement. And if you had written to me before, or you'd emailed to me before about a request like this, please take note that you need still to go through this step. All right. So as it says here, late submission will not be accepted. Students who have earlier indicated to their course teachers for taking final examinations off campus also need to submit a request via Ames. So please take note of that. And even if you had communicated something prior to this, still you have to go through this procedure that they outline here. All right, so please take note of that. Today is the deadline. So when is your exam? 15th of May, right? And it's in the afternoon, 2 to 4 p.m. And the venue is here in case any of you wish to do it on campus. It will be completely online. All right. So even if you were doing it on campus, you still would be doing it online. One other thing I want to remind you, if you choose to do it off campus, online, off campus, you do need to have, as previously, two cameras to be able to demonstrate that what you are doing and you're there and so forth. That procedure is still in place. All right. So this is a requirement of the university. You need to have two cameras focusing on you while you are taking the examination. All right. So of course that applies to anyone doing online off campus. But just to remind you, even if you are doing it on campus, you will be doing it online as well. So you will need to bring your notebook and be doing it in the venue, which will be LT14, but with your computer and doing it online. All right, so again, remind you about the term paper. So please take note of this and please complete that. It's the 23rd of April, and it's now open on Canvas for you to submit. And I think no need to remind you of the details. We've been over this, and I'm sure by now you are well into writing your term paper. Please remember the minimum word count, 800 words, due the 23rd of April, and that will be at the end of the review week. Okay? The announcement, the details, we've gone over, I think, sufficiently before. All right, so today what we're going to sort of look at are sort of an overview from these three perspectives. I'm going to do it in this order. It's not the order as in the title of the course as language and art, invention, inspiration, but today I'm going to do it in this order. I'm going to begin with invention, then art, then inspiration. We're also going to look at it from another perspective. We're going to be looking at the language of invention, art, and inspiration from the perspective of how language works to make meaning, and specifically make meaning in the sense of construing the world, explaining what's going on, interacting with others, the interpersonal, and just how the text itself becomes a text, how meaning is turned into the exchange that takes place, could be by speech, could be by writing. All right? Now, we're interested in how meaning is realized in wording, and we've looked at different aspects of this, and that's what I'd like to cover with you today. So we're looking at basically language and invention, art, and inspiration from three different angles, looking at it in terms of three different kinds of meaning and how that comes through then in the wording. We began with this. What is a metaphor? Well, this is pretty much the basis for what we're talking about throughout these last few weeks, and that is the language that allow the ability to invent, the language of science, the ability to be creative, this aesthetic value, art, and the ability to inspire very much comes from our ability to be able to use metaphor. I've mentioned this several times now, and I like the picture. It's a metaphorical way of describing what we're talking about. Russell Mears says that it is what we're talking about is a metaphoric cinematic screen on which is portrayed a partially glimpsed personal reality. It is what you're projecting. The scientist is projecting his findings, his insights into the world. It's never the whole picture. It's never the whole of reality. It is a theory. It is a metaphor. Now, the poet is projecting their view, their hypothesis of some aspect of the life of social man. It's this partially glimpsed, it's never complete, personal reality in which we are projecting it to make it known to others. It is this metaphoric cinematic screen. It's almost like we're projecting a film. Why do we need metaphor? It's to say what otherwise could not be said. It is to take the way we feel, our imagination, that which we don't even really see, except through our mind's eye, and giving it a reality. We began when we talked about, and we began where most of us begin in terms of metaphor. We grow up hearing about lexical metaphors. But we went beyond that. And we went beyond that, first of all, to look at what is grammatical metaphor. Grammatical metaphor, well, we illustrated it with an example from this speech by Donald Jung, where it's a way to, what should I say? There's usually more than one way to say something, okay? And here, for example, why did he choose, and what was the significance? And he could have said, but at another level, it reminds us of the power of ideas. Very straightforward. Remind is a verb. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he chooses the grammatical metaphor, a reminder. He changes the verb into a noun. He gives that verb a sense of nounness. In other words, what is being given to the verb is the meaning of a grammatical category, not the meaning of a word, the meaning of a grammatical category. And it had a significance. We call this grammatical metaphor. The idea being that there is the automatic, there is the default, there is the congruent. We represent things as nouns. We represent qualities as adjectives. We processes are verbs and so on. That's the straightforward. That's the default. That's the literal. All right. And it's as though we have meaning and wording, and they are two layers, and they are coupled together. They're connected together in this straightforward manner. But then we can go and become metaphorical in the sense that we can disconnect, we can decouple the links. And so here instead of a process as a verb, it becomes a noun. And in so doing, it takes on the qualities of a noun. It represents a thing. You're turning a verb into a thing. That becomes the means to innovate. Grammatical metaphor is a means to innovate. And we're innovating here at the level of the grammar, not just at the level of words. So grammatical metaphor is also a kind of de-automatization, where instead of the congruent, the literal, the straightforward representation of verbs for processes, nouns for things, we break that and we reconnect it another way. We de-automatize. Common in the language of academia, language of science. And instead of talking about actions, they educated girls, women acquired the vote. Taking those clauses, those messages, combining them with a conjunction. That's the clausal, it's the congruent way. It's the way we grow up talking. And then we go to school, we learn there's another way. We turn those verbs into nouns, the education of girls. We could call it an event thing. The acquisition of the vote by women, an event thing. Now you have two things. How do you make a clause? You need a verb. You need to show the relationship. The relationship now is not expressed through a conjunction because you're not connecting two clauses. You're connecting two nouns, nominal groups, event things, and so you need a verb. You change the conjunction into a verb. The shift is not just verbs becoming nouns. It's not just, it's conjunctions becoming verbs. It's a clause complex. It is they educated girls, one clause, and then another clause, women acquired the vote, into one simple clause. Two nouns connected by a verb, one verb. And what were clauses before now have become like a level of a phrase, a group, a nominal group, a noun phrase. So we looked at what was metaphor from two angles. From the angle of what Halliday was speaking about, where we're becoming more, in a way, becoming more abstract, yes. Turning verbs into nouns and nominalization, it becomes abstract, but at the same time, paradoxically, the more abstract we become in our theorizing, the more concrete. We're turning the world into a world of things. Russell Mears, on the other hand, again, it's paradoxical. The idea that instead of comparing like with like, we're comparing like with unlike. This is the basis of invention. And when we talk about invention, innovation, we're looking at the language of science. This is the interesting aspect of language. We think that, well, this is sort of the way it's always been done. No. We can see how language is evolving, how language is developing, and new ways of making meaning are arising. New strategies evolving, new ways of organizing the grammar. One of those who we can see it so clearly in his work is Sir Isaac Newton, optics. In that treatise, it goes through several stages. At the beginning, he describes his experiments, and as you would expect, it's described in a very clausal way, no grammatical metaphor. It's verbs, it's actions, it's the experiment, step by step, what he did. But then when he got to concluding and making arguments from those experiments, we begin to see more nominalization, more grammatical metaphor. And then when he finally formulated this all in these mathematical formulation, what he ended up were simple sentences, one clause only. If we wanted to put it in an equation, we'd say A equals X. And what is A and what is X? What is A? You go back to our example here. I think that illustrates it the best. What's A? The education of girls. What's X? The acquisition of the vote by women. What's the equal sign? What's the relation? The relation is expressed as a verb. And this is what we see already in Sir Isaac Newton's going from descriptions, conclusions, and then formulating all this. A and X, these lexically dense nominal groups, like we've just illustrated. So then, what Halliday points out is that by the end of the 18th century, this practice, nominalizing what was taking place in experience, the experiments, using the verb to signal the logical relationship between these event things. A causes X, A proves Y. This, as Halliday sums up, has become the most highly valued model for scientific writing. How do you impress people with your findings? This is the the way, this is the highly valued model. This is what people expect. Do you see the point that when it comes like to academic writing, it isn't, the causal is not necessarily the desirable. You might say, well, that's more straightforward. It's more clear. In fact, it is the congruent way. Why do we use the metaphorical? It's become what is valued. It evolved for a purpose. The purpose was to be able to condense ideas, to be able to freeze the world, give it a sort of fixed quality so that you could then describe it and talk about it. Now, Halliday himself asks, why? Why did scientific writers, Isaac Newton onwards, why did they favor this way of writing? Instead of writing, this happened, so then this happened, it's this event caused this event. Halliday continues, these were not arbitrary or random changes. It didn't just happen. The reason, he says, lies in the nature of scientific discourse. You remember, you're talking about language. Language is to fit a purpose, and the way we use language and the way language changes and evolves is to fit that purpose. Halliday continues, Newton and his successors were creating a new variety of English for a new kind of knowledge. A kind of knowledge in which experiments were carried out, general principles derived by reasoning from these experiments with the aid of mathematics, and these principles then in turn tested by further experiments. But on the other hand, Halliday points out, sometimes, it isn't a case where Sir Isaac Newton was sitting down and thinking, well, I think I'm going to change the language here. I think I'm going to use a grammatical metaphor. Of course, it wasn't talked about as grammatical metaphor. Halliday, in fact, says Newton and his contemporaries, they weren't even aware of their own use of grammar. It is the way language evolves. We almost are not aware of what we are doing with the language. We're not aware of how the language itself is changing. This should excite us in the sense that our potential for making meaning is never exhausted. As the nature of scientific inquiry changes and the discourse evolves to keep pace with those changes, we can anticipate new ways of meaning in the language of science. Is it this what we have as far as language and no further change? No. As the purpose becomes necessary to serve a particular purpose, the language will continue to evolve. Our potential for making meaning is never exhausted. Why? Because we always can go beyond the default. We can go beyond the automatic. You begin with a new ideology, a new way of meaning, a new way of speaking, a new way of thinking, a new way of meaning, and a new way of speaking. For Halliday, this is David Butt, Professor David Butt, Macquarie University, saying there is a particular significance in probabilistic shifts in the lexicogrammatical system. What he's saying is this, that it is becoming what he describes elsewhere as a novel intensity. The intensity, the frequency with which nominalization is taken over. The probability that in the language of academic discourse, this use of nominalization, it becomes the new norm. We say it's a kind of metaphor, it's a kind of de-automatization, but what is being created is a new automatic. These shifts away from the congruent, these instances of de-automatization that involve grammatical metaphor, they reoccur with such an intensity that the shifts, they become adrift in the direction of a nominalizing grammar. The new automatic in verbal science, it is the way of writing. It becomes the new automatic. It becomes a register, the language of science. Art. When we think about innovation, the language of science, invention, we come to art. And the question is, why do we value certain texts as art? Halliday says that languages have a value. They carry a value. When you say that's art, why does it carry that value? We need to explain that value in terms of what we know about how we make meaning, about meaning, or how meaning is made. You see, that's what as a linguist, when I look at an example of language as art, I want to explain what makes it art. How do we explain what makes art art? And that's what we've been discussing over the last few weeks. We need a way to be able to approach it. We need a way to be able to, if we're going to explain, we need a method, an approach. Halliday calls it what? He calls it a grammatiques. And he's saying that this approach, this method, it's not just for the language of art, it's also for the language of science. It's not just for spoken word, it's also for the written word. It doesn't matter the text, the method will be the same. But what we have to get away from is this idea of a ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary. What's the significance of that? This is art because I like it. No, that's not what that's not the way scientifically, scholarly to be able to approach it and answer that question. How do we explain what makes art art? What gives it that aesthetic value? What gives the language its functional value? How can we differentiate one text from another? How can we say that one is art and one is not art? One works, one doesn't work. We look at the response of people. That's one thing. How do people value it? People value it. That is an aspect of its meaning. So then our question is, what makes people respond the way they do? That makes them say, that's art? What makes them say, that speech is inspiring? What makes people respond the way they do? So what's our theory, method? What is this theory and method that Halliday speaks of? He calls it grammatiques, that will enable us to explain what sets apart certain texts as art. Step back with me a minute. What did Halliday say? It is that language, it's more than just all kinds of semiotic systems, as I mentioned before. You're driving down the street, your traffic light, red, yellow, green, that is a semiotic system. But language is something more than that. It makes meanings. Why? Because it includes this element of choice. It includes the element of, indeed, the metaphorical. What is meaning? As we've said, meaning is not just what you look up in a dictionary and that's the meaning of the word. We've gone beyond that, right? We've said that what is meaning is three kind of metafunctions. It is my way to reflect on the world. It's the way in which I join ideas together. It's the logical. It's the way I relate to other people, how I use language to form relationships. It's the way in which I take my ideas and I organize them into a flow of information, a text. But meaning can only really be observed through the wording. We have meaning, we have wording. And when we talked about wording, we've gone through different ways in which we've approached this. What kinds of processes are taking place? Who initiated? What are the circumstances? What does that tell you? That tells you what is going on in the world and how you reflect on your experience of what's going on. This is thinking grammatically. This idea of the wording, when we ask these questions, what kinds of processes are taking place? Who initiates? Who's affected? What are the circumstances? Are there dependent clauses? How are the clauses combined? What are the roles of the speaker and hearer? What's the attitude of the speaker? How is the message organized? So these questions, this is what we mean by thinking grammatically, thinking in terms of the wording, thinking in terms of the lexical grammar. So then, by thinking grammatically like this, how much can we learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? How a text comes to be valued aesthetically, functionally. I mentioned this quote before. Halliday, when he was looking at Tennyson's poem In Memoriam, and he was referring back to another scholar, Walker Gibson, who had been writing and also was looking at that same poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson. And there was this quote, which really sums up quite clearly what we're doing, how we're approaching it. This Walker Gibson wrote, "I submit then that Tennyson's poetic imagination his ability to create verbal art can sometimes be examined in terms of his grammar. It's in the grammar. The grammar is the resource by which we make meaning. It's also the means by which we can identify, as he puts it, the poetic imagination." Now, nowhere is this, I think, more clear than in the work of Professor Ruqayyah Hasan. This simple book, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art, in it, her approach to looking at language gives us a really good way of being able to take what Halliday's saying about relying on the grammar, approaching it through the grammar, and from that, being able to identify what is the poetic imagination. How does she do it? Well, first of all, we could sum up sort of poetic imagination in terms of this idea of symbolic articulation, articulating symbols, articulating metaphor. The whole poem becomes the vehicle by which to create the metaphor. What is the metaphor? what is it that what's she talking about? She's saying that in that poem, in that sort of text, there's language, and language as you could understand it, literal way, but then there's another order of meaning, another level of meaning. There is that poetic imagination. And how is that achieved? By taking the way that we normally use language, and from that articulating a symbol. So explain then, what is symbolic articulation? It is, and I quote here from Professor David Butt, mobilizing, putting into operation the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, the way you typically use language, and forming it into a non-habitual consistency, a pattern. You create for that text the automatic. Why? Why do you create the automatic? Why do you create that forest? So that you can then show that waterfall, that foregrounded, the point that you're wanting to make, so that you can express that hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. For Hassan, Professor David Butt, who was in fact a student of Professor Hassan, he did his PhD, as you can see, a number of years ago. He himself is now just retired, and he was one of Professor Hassan's PhD students. He says this: for Hassan, deautomatization occurs when the writer mobilizes the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non-habitual consistency, creating a background against which to foreground. Artistically, creating an automatization for that text, creating a pattern, a direction in which as we read it, we have a sense of going in a particular direction. But then the whole purpose of that is to de-automatize, creating a background against which to foreground. Why foregrounding? Why? Because why do you do that? Because out of that de-automatization, you're bringing something to our attention. Metaphorical meaning is created through patterning, creating the background, the automatic. And you can see the asterisk here and pointing down. That's what Professor David Butt was talking about. But then repatterning against that background. So foregrounding becomes a kind of de-automatization. And this, because it involves a pattern that is specific to the text, and repatterning against that pattern, what you're doing is you are creating an extended metaphor. The poem is an extended metaphor. So when you're working on your term paper and you're working on a particular text and you're analyzing that text and you're looking at it from the standpoint of what in fact was the automatic that this writer created in order to foreground against that. An extended metaphor is a kind of de-automatization. It is opening oneself up to a new way of understanding. So the key to innovation in verbal science is the same as the key to creativity in verbal art. And what is that? it's our ability. In the case of innovation in verbal science, it's the ability to recognize the automatic, recognize what's the congruent. In the case of verbal art, it's the ability to create the automatic, create a pattern. You create, you recognize the automatic against which to de-automatize. That's innovation. That's creativity. How do you know if it's in the case of the poetry and the literary? How do you know? You're talking about patterns. You're talking about looking for things that occur with a frequency. You're doing it sort of. You're quantifying this. You're counting. How do you then know if it indeed was part of the art, or was it just an accident? Just that's the way it turned out. No real deliberate design. We're asking is, what is there by that's deliberate? It's part of the craft. How do you know what's part of the craft? What's part of the art? What isn't? It isn't just a matter of one single contrast. There is a consistency in terms of the patterning at different levels. And the example that we looked at from Professor Hassan, the widower in the country, in that you'll remember it's just about the poets talking about this widower and his daily life, and it's a rather routine life. It's a rather lonely life. But then there are a number of sort of contrasts that we can see. For example, it's about this widower. What he does is it's the doing. It's not thinking. It's not feeling so much as it's just the activity of doing. So any other mention of any other kind of process, mental or verbal or whatever, that would be in contrast to the automatic. The automatic is doing. And who's the doer? The automatic it's the widower. Yeah, there are a few other participants that emerge from the poem. Well, that would be the foregrounding, the de-automatization, the logical. Throughout you see the repetition of and, simple parataxis, but then you encounter some sentences which are so complicated. They have parataxis and hypotaxis and embedding all in one sentence. Now those would be foregrounded. Throughout it's future tense, but then you encounter sometimes in the poem where the tense may be past. That's foregrounded. Theme. What occurs first in the clause? Well, typically, because the widower is the one doing, he's the grammatical subject, so likely he'd be the theme in most cases, but then there are some other choices about what was made theme. Those would be foregrounded. So across the board then, when you look at these and you find there's foregrounding, intransitivity, logical, tense, theme, and you look for the consistency, and you find that where does it all sort of coalesce? Where do you find foregrounding in terms of the fact that you have a sentence that involves a rather complex combination of parataxis, hypotaxis? Where do you notice that it involves the change in tense, the change in theme, the change in terms of the process type? All of these kinds of things, where do you notice it? You notice that it sort of all seems to gather at certain points, locations. There's a consistency across the board in terms of where the foregrounding draws your attention. The aching, the darkness, screaming. There's a fabric, you're weaving in and out of this text, the ways in which you are creating a pattern. But then this pattern is different, where it contrasts and where it sort of draws your attention, that is where the poet is saying to you, this is the message I'm conveying to you. This is the theme. This is the motif. This is the hypothesis I have about some aspect of the life of social man. This was Hassan's conclusion about Les Murray's Widower in the Country. It points, she says, to a theme concerning the essence of humanity. To be human, to be an individual, you need to be with others. You need to be in others' company. Literary artifact is an extended metaphor. It's about 1:45. I think we'll take a break here and come back in about 10 minutes, about 5 minutes to the hour, and we'll carry on. All right. So see you then. So we'll come back now. And as we're going through today, feel free to, if you have a question, feel free to speak out and to raise your question. I would welcome that as we're going through today, which is meant by way of review and highlighting what I hope will be significant points from the past semester. So again, if there's any question comes to mind, please feel free to bring it up. Now, I chose this example of the spoken word performance by Brandon Lee, and we looked at the audition, and we noticed that, I mean, the judge's response and subsequently the response of the TV viewing audience, which voted him into receiving the final award. He was the winner of America's Got Talent. Now, this was really striking. How could someone who's just the spoken word, no music, nothing, no dancing, no magic, all of those things which normally we associate with successful acts on America's Got Talent and those kind of talent shows. But here's someone, poetry. Now, that was striking. And how was it valued? Well, you could see the judges, how they responded to it. They were moved by it. They were impressed by it. And the audience to actually vote him through step by step so that he ends up becoming the winner. That says something about the way in which there was an appeal. There was something that was attractive. There was something that made his poetry have not just a function to make him win, but it obviously prompted people to respond the way they did, that showed that they valued what he was doing. Now, we looked at the audition spoken word performance. We noticed that there were some patterns that we could observe, that it got off to a start of being rather simple clauses that, in fact, at the beginning, up through the first 10 sentences, it was quite simple, not a great deal of parataxis or hypotaxis. Some embedding, not much. So it was simple. There was rhyme. Then, midway through his spoken word performance, which was about his sister's passing. It signals with but, and the but marks a turn compared with what has been the case so far in terms of what we just described. It marks a turning point. What was that turning point? Well, we notice that instead of active voice, instead of the being the poet as the doer, the initiator, with the active voice, the poet becomes the affected. It switches from active voice to passive voice, because he's now the affected. He's not the initiator. She left. That's active. Yes, she left. He was left. We also notice that in terms of what then follows, especially one sentence in particular, where there's so much that he's saying in that one sentence. And it's because there's the clauses so many clauses are combined together. Parataxis, hypotaxis, it is so much more complex than what was previously. And the lexical density then sharply rises, it peaks. There's so much going on just in that one sentence. And there's this sharp peak in lexical density. And not only that, the speed with which he is speaking suddenly accelerates, 200 words per minute. He's been slowly building to this point. And at this point now, however, it peaks. It peaks in terms of lexical density. It peaks in terms of the words per minute, the speed. That's foregrounding. Our attention is being drawn to that particular sentence. When we look at the poem, we notice that then it ends very much like it began. The same wording, in fact, is taken over at the beginning, is to hold on to love loosely, so when it leaves, it won't exit so painfully. That's at the beginning, and it's repeated at the end. The mention of 6 feet, 6 feet tall, that's repeated from the beginning in the end. The use of rhyme returns. It's come full circle. Past that event, his sister's passing, and the trauma of that passing. He's now come full circle. It peaks on that sentence 13. We notice now there's several contrasts that are going on at the same time. There's the presence versus absence of rhyme. There's simple versus complex clauses. The use of parataxis over hypotaxis. Elevated speed and lexical density, all sort of peaking in this one sentence, this one point. That's foregrounding. Yeah, he's drawing your attention to that. But what he's saying in a way is that it's almost like he comes full circle but to a different outlook on life and loss. Now, this is another one of his performances. I'm going to play it for you. We're going to take a look then at what was the response. And it obviously he's continuing step by step as he goes through the competition to ultimately become the winner. Here's this next.
And he's got everything. America, just sit quietly, listen, take it in.
When I'm up here on stage, they call me Brandon. When I'm with my homies, they call me B, and when I'm with the ladies, let's just say, they call me Taken because I'm already happily spoken for. But when I'm back at home, my mama, she called me Pookie. And though I'm not afraid to admit it, my mother calls me Pookie at like the most inopportune moments. For instance, today, on my way here to America's Got Talent, my mom screamed out the front door, "Make sure that you call me when you get there." Pookie. And like, I get why my mother says it out of courtesy, but to be real, I don't understand why my mom's so concerned with my safety, praying for me as I leave the house on a daily, because I'm just a young man who has faith in Jesus. The same way that stars have faith that space will protect them from this galactic bully we call gravity, who longs to turn their stardust splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of its depth. So yes, I never really understood the issue. And then I went on Facebook, and I realized that my mama loved me the same way every mother loved their son, fearfully. Because normally, death don't really bother me. I mean, I'm from Southside Stockton. I'm all too familiar with how some family reunions only ever take place on graveyard grass, and how a hole can be a safe haven for a soul in this mortal game of hide and go seek. But there is something so different about Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Jacob Blake, and the countless others. And as I stared at that screen, I couldn't help but think I was looking at a mirror image of myself being choked out for merely existing, or for daring to be more than 3/5 of what them folk thought them to be. Or maybe it was simply due to their hue, and in that moment I better understood my black mother's greatest fear was every time I leave her home, on the other side of my phone will no longer be her son, will be America's next most popular hashtag, accompanied by a video of her young star being gunned down by gravity as my stardust is turned splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of my death. So yes, my mother's greatest fear is that I won't return home breathing, blood pulsing through these veins enough to still be her Pookie. And my mama warned me, "Son, don't you dare get caught at the wrong place at the wrong time with that wrong-colored skin, because those 3 strikes, they lead to pine box convictions, and I need you to return home my Pookie again." So dear Mom, I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to make it back home to you. But if I don't, just know you was the very last thing on my mind. And I will always, always be your Pookie.
Brandon Leak.
That was very, 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 very powerful, and I'm happy that you chose this platform to talk about what you just did. I think it is so important. Your spoken words, your honest words, your true words, your necessary words. Thank you. You're my favorite act of the night.
Sophia.
What a great way for us to end the night. It's something special, that talent that you have, and I really wish you the best luck tonight, because I wanna keep hearing you. I wanna see what you can bring next.
Howie.
Well, I gotta say, this is above and beyond anything I've seen, anything I've ever heard, especially at this time. It was so perfect. You took an older white guy and put myself into the body of an African-American mother, just hoping that her son survives life. And this is the conversation we're having now. This is the conversation, I'm not getting political, but this is the conversation that America needs to have. And there is no better, more entertaining, more woke, more educational way. I am so proud to be here in this room. I'm so proud that I pushed the golden buzzer. In my heart, you just won the whole night. You really did.
Okay. Now, we'll approach it in terms of its language. We're interested in how he takes and forms patterns. An obvious one is at the very beginning. When I'm up here on stage, they call me Brandon. When I'm with my homies, they call me B. And that when they call me, that continues on for the first four sentences. It's obviously a pattern that forms. And we can see it if we look at theme. What is theme? The when. Obvious there, a pattern is formed. The shift between I, they, and so on. We can see in terms of its logical structure as well. The same kind of connection is being made. It's a kind of hypotaxis. It's a kind of enhancement. It deals with time, when, all indicated by the conjunction when. Now, if I add up all of the relations on the left side of your screen, those would be the parataxis, and there's 9 relations of parataxis. There's 23 instances of relations involving hypotaxis. So 72% hypotaxis, 28% parataxis. Well, that would be what you'd expect if it was a speech that was being made, a dynamic speech, a political speech. A more hypotaxis. It has that sense of being obviously well thought out. It's not obviously spontaneous. But again, what stands out to me is where there is no parataxis, no hypotaxis. And there are only 3 sentences where that's the case. And if I look at those, so yes, I never really understood the issue, because normally death don't really bother me. There's something so different. And then he lists out the names of those who were very much on the public mind, of those who had been recently killed. He's drawing our attention that never really understood, the understanding that I want you to keep in mind those elements. I want you to also notice something here. In fact, in terms of the kinds of processes that occur, there's something, that is existential. Something exists. And when he goes on to the next sentence, choked out from merely existing, just the idea of existing. Is that contrasted then with what else is going on? The idea that it's not just, these people don't just exist. This idea of using the existential at this point, where then he goes on to, and you'll notice, if you look at the right side of your screen, you'll see that sentences 17, 18, and you look at the text, you'll notice that then that's where, almost like in the previous spoken word performance, there is this peak where the sentence becomes so complex, and obviously the lexical density becomes so much greater, and the speed becomes also greater. But we notice something else, and that is repetition. Similar also again to his puff, the puff text, I like to call it, that first audition. You have a pair, splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of its depth. And he repeats that in sentence 18. But notice something else. If we take a look at the use of conjunctions, this conjunction so, and followed by sort of an interpersonal theme, yes, yes. Now, notice that a splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of its depth. It followed immediately by so yes. 18, splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of my death. So yes. So the patterning is not just the repetition there, it's how it carries on. And so what seems to be identified here is sort of a block that begins so yes and ends with that same idea of turned splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of my death. The idea that it's just something for people to watch. It's the impersonality of it is in such contrast with how much his mother loves him, how much his mother cares for him, how people know him by name and call him. These people also that he lists, they have names too. They don't just exist. It's not just existing. They're loved. They have names. They have people that care about them, people that call them. There's several words that are sort of repeated here, and very ideas, sort of a motif of fear. He repeats again twice, my black mother's greatest fear, my mother's greatest fear. And he talked before in sentence 12, fearfully. What is that fear? That fear is something that he is understanding. But the whole idea was not just he is beginning to understand. It is what he's trying to convey to the audience so that the audience understands. We are like him, trying to understand what is this fear. You'll notice again, there's another pairing here. The beginning, the mother direct speech. Make sure that you call me when you get there, Pookie. And at the end, son, don't you dare get caught in the wrong place. The two points of dialogue where she is speaking. We hear her voice. The complexity of the 17, 18 I've mentioned. When I look at the kinds of processes that are used, you notice call. Now, that's interesting. When I sort of do a tabulation to try to look at the different process types here, material, mental, relational, behavioral, verbal. Now, when I look at these, I'm sorry it goes off the screen. That doesn't matter too much. In the sense that the two participants, the two primary participants here, and I was looking at what kind of role they had. Is it in the ER role or the ED role? And the first person, the poet, Brandon Lee himself, you know, in terms of doing, he is the affected. But you know, it's all the same verb. Call. How he's called. The mother is the one of those. The role that she has in terms of doing is calling him. In terms of process types, the mental process, I've highlighted 5 occurrences where it's all understand, realize, to get it. It's about understanding. You see, the poem is what's it about? It's about achieving an understanding. The understanding that he comes to, that he realizes. It's an understanding about his mother's fear. Use his words, black mother's fear for her son. Understanding, what is this fear? What about her son? Her son, he has a name. She calls him Pookie. There is a contrast that's developed between the personal, called by name, loved, versus the impersonal, merely existing. A splendid spectacle, the indefinite. A splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of death. The impersonal. This contrast. When we look at the names of those who have been identified as those who had passed, been killed, they had a name. They also were called. They also were loved. They also didn't deserve to just be treated as though they are a fact, that they just exist. They have a name. And it's this personal versus the impersonal. It's this striking sense of this being loved, being cared for, that prompts the fear. And it's understanding what that fear is. Now, this comes through the language, from the choices that are being made here, from the patterns that you see, the pairs of items here and there. Gradually, when we listen to it, we don't hear those patterns. We don't see them. They are there subtly, communicating a message. We looked at different commencement speeches. It is, I would say that, especially when we look at David Foster Wallace, Steve Jobs, we're looking at, they are crafted. There is a design to these speeches. We notice the idea of communicating to the audience, the use of you in it. Throughout Steve Jobs, it's his stories of his life. It's very much the first person, but then you takes on such an importance, especially at the end of each of those stories, because the whole purpose of that speech is to motivate the audience, not just tell the story, but to connect with the audience. But that's what a typical commencement speech is supposed to be about. An atypical, not typical kind of commencement speech was that given by David Foster Wallace. We called it the anti-text. Anti-text meaning in the sense that, as Halliday talks about, an anti-language. It's an alternative reality. It's a counter reality. It's in opposition to some established norm. Halliday says it's not the distance between two realities, but the tension between them that is significant. The distance need not be very great. The one, in fact, is a metaphorical variant of the other. It's the anti-language is the de-automatized. And in this case, we're talking about the anti-text. And we said that the reason why this is water would be considered the anti-text is it goes against everything that we expect from a commencement speech. He himself says so. It's not this grand, inspirational speech. It is contrary to his typical style. Here it is more direct. And so it becomes, in a way, the commencement speech becomes a metaphorical variant, pointing to a counter reality. The whole point of his speech, why is it the anti-text? Why isn't it the typical commencement speech? Because the whole point that he's trying to get across is the idea of basically de-automatizing, going against the default. What was the significance of that? What the hell is water? When you're so caught up in something, that's all you can see, and you don't know that anything else exists. That's what you are all surrounded with. That is the default. It's the automatic, and it becomes something that you have to be able to step outside of it. You have to be able to see that this is water. The whole commencement speech was about the need to de-automatize. That was his hypothesis. Break out of the default. As he puts it here, that is real freedom. That is being educated, understanding how to think. The alternative is unconsciousness, unaware. the default setting, the automatic, the rat race, the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. The key to innovation in verbal science, the key to creativity in verbal art, is our ability to recognize the automatic. The ability in creativity in verbal art is the ability to create the automatic, to create. What is the automatic? The automatic, this is water. And to de-automatize. And to be able to know that that is the, to be able to recognize what is the automatic, to recognize what is the default. And so you can go beyond that and be innovative and be creative. So I return to the question, by thinking grammatically, by thinking, looking at how language is used to make meaning, how much can we learn about how a text comes to mean what it does? The whole point is we're never getting the whole reality. Even as a linguist, what I'm describing is a partially glimpsed reality. I'm getting some of it. Umberto Eco says this: I would define the poetic effect as the capacity that a text displays for continuing to generate different readings without ever being completely consumed. That's what he's saying is the poetic effect. It can be understood. Different readings. And never completely consumed. Grasped only in terms of some of it, because there's more. Remember Edwin Tumbu? As he said, I'm looking at language as part of my life, trying to create, to make my poems, putting language together. Technique is all about poetry in the making, the chiseling of language, the rearranging of language, the sound, the rhythm, the tautness, the layering. What releases the technique is what releases the poem into a form of immortality. Immortality is the same thing that we just were mentioning. This idea that meaning, the understandings is never completely consumed. It always can be understood. We looked at a number of examples of Edwin Tumbu's poetry. Gods Can Die, where he builds up a automatic of parataxis, which he then foregrounds against it with hypotaxis. Tumbu's David, where he does the reverse. He creates a background of basically hypotaxis against which he foregrounds parataxis. My favorite, A Poet Reading. So much is happening throughout this poem on so many levels. Okay, we have looked at innovation, looked at art. Let's look at inspiration. I have a dream. How do you inspire people through language? Martin Luther King's I have a dream. It's recognized the historical significance of that speech. I have a dream. And he repeats that as he goes through. I have a dream that one day in the Red Hills of Georgia, I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi. It continues.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
He continues, I have a dream. I have a dream today. It's repeated. Yes, that you get that sense of that repetition. Yes, it's a pattern. It creates a rhythm. It creates a direction in which we're going. And then he have a dream and then he starts quoting from the Bible. That one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low. And this is a direct quote from the Bible. The glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. And then he begins a new pattern. With this faith, we will be able to hew out the mountain of despair, a stone of hope. With this faith. And he continues.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
So there's this repetition. There is this, to work together, to pray. You have layer upon layer of repetition, each embedded in one another with this faith, and then to work together, to pray together. It is continuously, and every time it's repeated, the tempo increases, it becomes stronger. Well, let's look at a very different text.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, UNICEF Executive Director, and all the excellencies and distinguished guests from across the world. My name is Kim Namjoon, also known as RM, the leader of the group BTS. It is an incredible honor to be invited to an occasion with such significance for today's young generation. Last November, BTS launched the Love Myself campaign with UNICEF, building on our belief that true love first begins with loving myself. We've been partnering with UNICEF's End Violence program to protect children and young people all over the world from violence. And our fans have become a major part of this campaign with their action and with their enthusiasm. We truly have the best fans in the world. And I'd like to begin by talking about myself. I was born in Ilsan, a city near Seoul, South Korea. It is a really beautiful place with a lake, hills, and even an annual flower festival. I spent a very happy childhood there, and I was just an ordinary boy. I used to look up at the night sky and wonder, and I used to dream the dreams of a boy. I used to imagine that I was a superhero who could save the world. And in an intro to one of our early albums, there's a line that says, "My heart stopped when I was maybe 9 or 10. Looking back, I think that's when I began to worry about what other people thought of me and starting seeing myself through their eyes. I stopped looking up at the night skies, the stars. I stopped daydreaming. Instead, I just tried to jam myself into the malls that other people made. Soon, I began to shut out my own voice and started to listen to the voices of others. No one called out my name, and neither did I. My heart stopped and my eyes closed shut. So, like this, we all lost our names. We became like ghosts. But I had one sanctuary, and that was music. There was a small voice inside of me that said, "Wake up, man, and listen to yourself." But it took me quite a long time to hear music calling my real name. Even after making the decision to join BTS, there were a lot of hurdles. Some people might not believe, but most people thought we were hopeless. And sometimes I just wanted to quit. But I think I was very lucky that I didn't give it all up. And I'm sure that I and we will keep stumbling and falling like this. BTS has become artists performing in those huge stadiums and selling millions of albums right now, but I am still an ordinary 24-year-old guy. If there's anything that I've achieved, it was only possible that I have my other BTS members right by my side, and because of the love and the support that our ARMY fans all over the world made for us. And maybe I made a mistake yesterday, but yesterday's me is still me. Today, I am who I am with all of my faults and my mistakes. Tomorrow, I might be a tiny bit wiser, and that'll be me too. These faults and mistakes are what I am, making up the brightest stars in the constellation of my life. I have come to love myself for who I am, for who I was, and for who I hope to become. I like to say the one last thing. After releasing our Love Yourself albums and launching the Love Myself campaign, we started to hear remarkable stories from our fans all over the world, how our message helped them overcome their hardships in life and start loving themselves. Those stories constantly remind us of our responsibility. So, let's take all one more step. We have learned to love ourselves. So now I urge you to speak yourself. I like to ask all of you, what is your name? What excites you and makes your heart beat? Tell me your story. I want to hear your voice. I want to hear your conviction. No matter who you are, where you're from, your skin color, your gender identity, just speak yourself. Find your name and find your voice by speaking yourself. I'm Kim Namjoon, and also RM of BTS. I'm an idol, and I'm an artist from a small town in Korea. Like most people, I've made many and plenty mistakes in my life. I have many faults, and I have many more fears, but I'm gonna embrace myself as hard as I can. And I'm starting to love myself gradually, just little by little. What is your name? Speak yourself. Thank you very much.
Hey, what do you take away from that speech? What kind of speech is it? In many ways, it's what we've been calling a motivational speech. It's very first person as it begins. It's I, very first person. My heart, my eyes, my name. Interspersed, we have we, because he is speaking for his group. But again, it's me, I, very, very much first person. Then he switches to, I would like to say one last thing. We and our becomes first person, plural, but the next step is what? Let's all take one more step. That first person, plural, imperative, let's. And he proceeds then, it becomes directed at his audience. You, your name, your voice. Again, setting up his life as an example for those that are listening to him. Find your name, find your voice by speaking yourself. Speak yourself. Repeat it there twice, but then at the end as well. Speak yourself 3 times. he repeats this imperative: speak yourself. In many ways, it has those same elements that we've been looking at and identifying in other motivational speeches. You have the imperatives. You have the first person, but there is the second person reference that it comes to, just like Steve Jobs does as well. Illustrating with examples, his life, the repetition. It incorporates many of those features, what we would expect in a kind of motivational speech. No, it's nothing on the scale of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. That shaped history. That shaped society. That really moved people. What moves us? What makes meaning? What we're saying is that if you want to really understand what is invention, innovation, art, inspiration, the only way to really get at it is to look at it in terms of how language itself is being used. Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. So how do we think grammatically? That's the other element of this course we've been looking at. It is, yes, we've looked at examples of innovation, art, inspiration, but all along the question we have been asking ourselves is, how can we approach these texts in a way to understand why they are art, why they are considered motivational? How does a text come to mean what it does? How come it's valued the way it is? The only way to get at that is through the language and understanding. And that is the basis of the craft. It's the basis of the design that goes into making these kinds of texts. And so we return back to what we started with, this same idea. We have meaning and then we have the wording. So let's take the first one. And here I'm trying to make the point. Yes, we've looked at the nature of text as innovation, as art, as inspiration. But here I'm asking you to think about how we can approach that text and how this, I hope what you see is not just to appreciate language as it's used, but to also apply it to yourself in terms of your own use of language. Even in the language of science, you are seeking to persuade. You may not be going into politics, you may not become a poet, but no matter what, you are going to be needing to use language to impress, to make people believe what it is you're saying, to persuade people. Hopefully, yes, to inspire people. We call it the system of transitivity, the choice of process, participant, circumstance. The kinds of processes. Now, we've been looking at this from we've identified doing, processes of sensing, knowing, mental, processes of saying. We've broken down the nature of verbs into these categories, these 6 categories. And how we did so was basically identifying the nature of what's involved. We compared the illustration I gave you very early on. We compared Donald Jung with Susan Rice. The idea that looking at those speeches, looking at who is the initiator, who's the affected, and we can see that in looking at Brandon Leake's poem as well, how he shifted from the being in the ER role to being in the ED role. He became the affected. Well, that was a twist when it came to, that was a turn that that poem took. And in looking at Donald Jung, we saw that the importance of who's the doer, as opposed to Susan Rice, that it represented the way they saw the world, the way their ideology. For Donald Jung, things are in the saddle and ride mankind. We are not in control. For Susan Rice, we are in control. The world won't be changed unless we change it. Two very different perspectives on life, but those perspectives come through in the choices they make in language. And I'm telling you, the way you see the world is coming through in the choices that you make in the way that you see the world. Your ideology comes through. Now, we looked at this also in the sense of when we looked at Donald Trump. And we asked the question, what does it mean to speak presidentially or not in his case? We had the example of, we looked at two examples of his speaking to Congress and his speaking at the CIA headquarters. In the speech to Congress, it was exactly what you would expect from Obama, from Nixon. Maybe not the content, but the structure's there. The way the grammar is being used to repeat things. America's strong, America's proud, America's free. The way of sort of what we called a logical progression, how you ended the torch of truth, liberty, and justice, and then that's taken up as the beginning of the next sentence, that logical progression. We call it a linear progression. These elements we saw in his, and this was considered presidential. And then he gave the speech to the CIA headquarters. And it was nothing like his speech to Congress. He switched topics midstream. He'd be talking about something, and then suddenly he'd interact with the audience. Did everybody like the speech? And then we did a thing, this very vague kind of speaking. What does it mean, we did a thing? And then change the topic, and then change the topic to talking about the media coverage of the inaugural, changing it to talking about the rain at the inaugural. But then you notice something about, and this comes back to the choice of process, participant, circumstance. In the speech to CIA, what occurs first in the clauses that make up the text? You, I, we. What about the speech to Congress? Well, the we stands out. The point being that for Donald Trump, many regarded him as not speaking presidentially. Because one of the reasons being because he didn't stay on topic. And that was largely what one saw in his speaking, was that he wasn't speaking to a script. He wasn't speaking like a politician. And to many, I really feel that one of the major attractions of Trump was the fact that he came across as the anti-politician. And in his speech, he didn't want to sound like a politician. He wanted to sound like this rich guy, this rich businessman from New York City. He played up that way of speaking because, yes, it did win him a level of support where people valued the very fact that he didn't sound like a politician. And one of the aspects of the way he spoke was the number of first-person references. Now, what's wrong with that? I mean, you just saw in the speech I played with the member of BTS speaking at the United Nations. Well, that was awfully first person. But that was a motivational speech, and that's expected. Steve Jobs, that was a lot first person. That was in that context, for that audience, in that nature of that text. That was expected. But here, people took exception to it. I, me, or my 850 times in 7 speeches, 3.3% are self-references. You see, that's not how a politician is supposed to speak, though. Remember Obama, Romney, in their debate performance? In a debate where you are trying to get people to vote for you, then you can sort of play up who you are and what you have accomplished and why people should vote for you. And so the first person you again see more frequently. So the point being, it depends on the context. It depends on the purpose. And what some values, others will not value. You know, in fact, if you look at that speech to the CIA headquarters, the use of the first person singular isn't like in here 3.3, which they said was so remarkable. Here it's 14%. In the speech to the CIA headquarters, 14% of it was I, me, my. 7% in when he talks about we. Now contrast that with Nixon, first person singular in his second inaugural, 0.6%. Hardly. 3%. In Trump's own speech to Congress, 2.6%. You cannot say, oh, you cannot use the first person reference. It depends on the nature of the speech. It depends on the function, the purpose of that text, that context. Now, come back to what we've been talking about, and that is, again, I'm still on this point about how we use the nature of how we reflect on the world, process, the choice of processes, participants, circumstance. What I'm saying is, if I look at just these 3 elements, the nature of the process, who is in the ER role, it can tell me a lot. We saw it with Donald Jung and Susan Rice. You can see it here with Trump. In his speech to the CIA headquarters, well, 54% is people, I, you, we, they. Half of the speech is people. 24% first person. And what is first person doing? That speech to the CIA headquarters, it wasn't even what Trump was mainly doing. It was what he felt. It was what he said. Contrast that with the speech to Congress. The speech was 72% was doing, and 20% of it is done by we, only 5% by I. Very different. But that made the difference between how people perceive the speech. It is a factor. Okay, we've looked at transitivity. What about logical? And I'm looking at the time, I notice it's about 1:52. I think maybe it's time to take a break before we come back for the last hour. So we'll take a break here for about 10 minutes and come back about two minutes past the hour, okay? So let's take a break here. Okay, I've been commenting there are a few chat messages, Just to first of all, thank you for pointing out the fact that the PowerPoint, the PDF versions were not for this course, and I've corrected that now during the break as well. So it will be the PowerPoint that was supposed to be for today's class is now been put up. So thank you for pointing that out. Another question that came up, I won't go into, it was sent to me, not to the whole group, and the question was related to the level of linguistic analysis. What I'm wanting you to do for this course is I'm not expecting to turn you into linguists, all right? Because there are other courses that would delve into that more deeply. I, for example, teach a course on text linguistics in which we follow similar methods and approaches to being able to identify the patterns. But what I want you to do here is I hope that after going through the various examples that we've looked at, and after you have been made aware of the kinds of things to look for, that you will have an idea of what those, for especially with respect to the term paper and the text you've chosen, you will have an idea of the kinds of things that you should be paying attention to, looking for patterns, looking for the use of, like we've just gone through, the process type, who's in the ER role, who's in the ED role. Do you see a pattern emerge that tells you something that either in the case of Donald Jung and Susan Rice shows their outlook on the world, or in the case of Donald Trump expresses a very different way of being able to speak as a politician. In fact, as we said, sort of like the anti-text, the anti-politician. So in fact, it's about the choices that people make and the choices they don't make. And it's about and what I'd like you to have is a sensitivity to the kinds of things to look for patterns. We've looked at transitivity. We'll continue now. We'll take a look at the other aspects that we've been highlighting and looking at across what I've tried to do today is also bring into it the various texts that we've been looking at. Okay. Now, normally I just would tell you, anyways, it's the 13th week, for the chat, if you send a chat specifically to me, I will only probably see it in the break, because then I will look at the chat window. Because otherwise, if I open up the chat, it will sort of block out a bit of what you see on the screen. So for example, if I open the chat now like this, and you'll see a big block on your screen. And that's why I minimize it during the time of the lecture, and really only open it during the break. So I have another computer here where I can see the chat for messages that I sent to the whole group. But because it's not, I'm on two computers, this one, this by my side, doesn't show the chat for specifically sent to the computer I'm using for the presentation. All right, so just to clarify that, if you seem to send a chat to me right now, by the way, I again reiterate what I said at the beginning of the last hour. Speak up. Please feel free to speak up. I'd be glad to hear from you. And so let's continue. Logical. What does it mean? Logical relations between clauses. Are there dependent clauses? How are the clauses combined? So the kinds of things that we noticed it. This term, parataxis, hypotaxis, it's not just linguists that use those terms. It is sort of people do have a sense of how clauses are combined, and the idea that, for example, hypotaxes. This idea that Trump can't seem to do that. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of Trump. I'm not trying to defend Trump, but I want to be accurate here. And that is to say that you can't say that Trump doesn't know how to use hypotaxes. That really is an exaggeration, because he does. And we saw it in the speech to Congress, and you might say, well, that's written for him. Well, Nixon's speeches were written for him. Obama's speeches were written for him. They do have speech writers, yes. And you can see a pattern emerge in those kinds of speeches where there's a much more hypotaxis than parataxis. The speech to the CIA was not like he doesn't know hypotaxis. It was more, but the balance was 50-50 almost. That's what stood out. Now, compare that with Nixon's departure speech. Well, remember, he spoke it out, and it obviously was unscripted. There, it was almost like he was just talking extemporaneously. He was not as the thoughts came to him. There you can see parataxis, 63%, hypotaxis, 37%. Again, pointing out the difference in when you're speaking without a script, just on the spur of the moment, you are more likely to be more paratactic. You're just sort of stringing ideas together. Hypotactic requires some thought about how you're going to relate the ideas together, how you're going to develop an idea. Now, you'll notice that Obama's inaugural was almost, again, 50-50, and that was heavily criticized. So, remember Obama's address, it was lack of eloquence. Stanley Fish. Stanley Fish is not a linguist. Stanley Fish is a literary critic. He writes for the New York Times. But you'll notice he says surely more paratactic than hypotactic. Well, it was not more paratactic. It was basically 50-50. And that is striking in itself. When it does almost balance, it does, in a way, come across as quite, it doesn't seem to be as valued in a kind of address as when we have more hypotaxis than parataxis. The power, he said, is in discrete moments rather than in a thesis proved by the marshaling of evidence. The ideas didn't develop. And we saw that. We noticed that Obama's inaugural, if I looked at the architecture of it, you can see it's flat because you had paragraphs 6 through 9, paragraphs 10 through 18. And each of them seems to be, you have this block and then this block and then this block. And what contributed to that sense of, okay, there's this block of paragraphs with one idea, then there's this block of paragraphs with another idea. That's what Stanley Fish meant by discrete moments. Elsewhere, he says it's like going to an art museum. I mentioned this, I think, before. And you go to one picture, you look at the picture, you take it in, and then you walk on ahead and you go to the next painting, you look at it, you take it in and on. And that's sort of what he's saying, how this speech was constructed. But what contributed to that feeling was the fact that each of these blocks not only maybe had a different focus, it also had a different grammatical pattern. So that in the case of 38 through 52, remember, it more or less modeled what had been said by John F. Kennedy. To those old allies, we pledge. To those new states, we pledge. For Obama, it was to all the other peoples, know this. For those, we say to you now. And a very similar kind of And that was purposeful. As we said, his speechwriters went through all these inaugural addresses given by past presidents and took out the patterns to be able to incorporate them into Obama's speech. So it would have this quality of being sort of presidential. It didn't work. It didn't work well because people felt it was very diffuse. It was all like spread out. It wasn't like an idea that was developing toward some goal. Then the next block of paragraphs, basically using cleft sentences, predicated themes. It is precisely this spirit that must inhabit us all. It is ultimately the faith and determination which this nation relies, etc. And gone on. The next block, this is, that. Each of the blocks had their own pattern. So it wasn't just the content that may have been unique about each of these blocks. It was the grammar, the patterning in that grammar, which contributed to this architecture, which made it flat, diffuse, exactly what people commented. Textual meaning. All right, we looked at what we call ideational in terms of the experiential, the logical, now the textual, the use of theme. What is theme? This is this normally, if you think about literature, and when we talked about Hassan, remember she said the theme, that being the hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. Typical in literature, talk about the theme, the motif. But here, Halliday's use of it is quite specific to his grammatical approach to language, because he's talking about how each clause begins. And what he observed, and you have several statements here about what is theme, the starting departure point of the message. Yes, that's how it starts. It's how it begins. It's a choice you're making. What the speaker wants to talk about, it's that too. Very often we begin with what we want to talk about. It orients the clause within the context. It fits what was said before with what follows. Yes, it's all of these points. It's related to the method of development of the text, how the text develops. Theme gives us when we're reading it, when we're listening to it, what we're doing is we're noticing the choices that are being made by the speaker, by the writer. We use the way that each clause begins as a way to sort of understand the flow of what's being said. You see, it's not just like, well, the linguists pay attention to what occurs first. No. What we're saying is, this is an aspect of the meaning, how the text is organized. It's what you, as a reader, without you probably even realizing it, it's what you're paying attention to. And we looked at some examples throughout the semester where if you sort of took a text, you could make it rather incoherent. Even though it was grammatical, you could make it incoherent by switching around what was theme, how the clauses began. You can turn it into nonsense. It's significant, and it informs the reader, informs the listener. This is what I want to talk about. This is how the text is developing. This is the flow of information. Yes, it's simple. A lot of the things that we're talking about are simple. What kind of process? What kind of participants? Whether it's paratactic or whether it's hypotactic. Is it independent clauses or dependent clauses? What occurs first in the clause? These are all rather simple, but it's what we also can be very significant in terms of how we respond to, how we understand what's being said. And it's the basis of these habitual patterns. Patterns of what? Patterns in terms of choice of what we put as theme. Remember the speech by Malala? In her speech, the first half of it, I. Typically, throughout that first 15 paragraphs, I. The second half, almost right down the middle, we. You notice it isn't you, I, and we. I, it's her story. We, it's our story. But that is signaled to us by the choice of theme. So the first half of her speech, I. Second half of her speech, yes, you had 3 occurrences of I, but mostly it's we. It's shifted. Remember also Halliday's analysis of Darwin's Origin of Species, and what he looked at was theme. And what impressed him was that the choices of what were mentioned in theme position, in that first initial position of each clause, and what was mentioned toward the end of the clause, these created ideas, motifs, that then, as he puts it, all was brought together at that last sentence. All of it bringing the clause, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, the book to a crashing conclusion with a momentum to which I can think of no parallel elsewhere in literature. Literature, but this is a scientific treatise. Yes, the language of science can be art, can be valued as art. Why? Because of the way the writer chose to write. And taking all those ideas that had been developed over the course of this text, these last 2 paragraphs of Origin of Species, and taking those ideas and bringing them all together in a climax at the very end, where everything is sort of encapsulated at the end of it. So you had all of these various, there's grandeur, ennoblement in this view of life with several powers, having been breathed into a few forms or into one. Each of these ideas comes through. Some people may say, well, language of science is not art. It can be art. But what makes it art? What makes it art is the way language is used. We talked about the difference between spoken and written language. Halliday's idea, writing puts language in chains. It freezes it. It becomes something to be reflected on. And that's why you notice more hypotaxis. You have a chance, it's thought out, and it's also meant to be reflected on. How the ideas relate one to the other, where you have a main idea and then supporting ideas. It was necessary for science, scientific knowledge. It required a medium through which you could take ideas, develop those ideas. It turns out to be a highly nominalized world, as we've seen, grammatical metaphor, high lexical density. All of these features enable it to become what we would consider technical. And so you take this example we looked at before, and if we understood it, we'd say that it's a simple sentence. It's a simple clause. There's no parataxis. There's no hypotaxis. There's just 2 things related by the verb to have. But the nouns The things involve so much post-modification, so many ideas packed together, creating a lexical density that involves embedding, that involves grammatical metaphor, the potential from a verb to be able to, intrusions from a verb to intrude, legitimate privacy from the adjective private. And you have the potential for intrusions by the government. You have layer upon layer. All of this complexity it's not something that we notice in speaking, it's in writing. Simple clause sentence structures. Typically one clause, one or two nominal groups, propped up by a verbal group, the verb to be, a relational process. It's the same exact thing we just noticed when we talked about Sir Isaac Newton's The Optics and these mathematical formulations, where you have basically a simple clause with two nouns related by a verb. Writing and speaking, Halliday's saying it's complementary. We need both. What's a spoken language like? Well, we've been looking at it. We looked at it in terms of what you notice with Trump, yeah, his speech to the CIA. You notice it with Nixon's departure speech. We can see that kind of, when it's purely spoken, spontaneous, spoken language, you have many clauses, and they will be related largely by parataxis. But Halliday makes this point, and that is that it's not to say the spoken language has no grammar, no organization. It does, but it's different. I gave you this example of an academic text, and we were looking at, you don't have references to the writer. You have a lot of what we would call embedding, nominalization. You have, again, lexically dense noun phrase structures, heavy post-modification, grammatical metaphor, verbs that are turned into nouns. And we see that it can have an impact. We looked at that, the language of that justice in court who was summing up the evidence. And because it was all written out beforehand, because it is the language of writing, it had all those features of writing. He uses the passive in subordinate clauses, in dependent clauses, combining many clauses into one sentence, omitting the relative pronoun. All of these features figured in the way he uses language. But yeah, and what we noticed was that in this case, it more or less did not serve the purpose well. It accomplished the goal of being able to sum up the evidence, but it meant that who benefited from hearing it? Most people would not have been able to follow it because it is written language being spoken, and we don't have access to the written text. That sort of disconnect between how language is being used and the purpose to which it's being put. We also, you see, have a way to evaluate, not only when we talk about evaluating and assigning a value, it's not just, well, we can say what's art and why it's art, but we also can say not just the aesthetic values, but the functional value. And the value of this kind of use of language in the courtroom really defeats the purpose that it was intended to perform. High lexical density. And again, the example that I gave of the departure speech is an example of spoken language. Interpersonal meaning, modality. And I gave you the example of Nixon's resignation speech. And what was interesting here is the use of modal auxiliaries like shall and will and must, can, may, should, would. And the point was that there's a pattern that emerges from this, that in this speech where he's going to resign, he resigns in 8, all right? He's going through and we're looking at the paragraphs as we're going through that. In paragraph 8, he actually resigns. And he says, I shall resign. Up until that point, you can see the modal auxiliaries. Must, may, might, would. Would occurs so much. What does would suggest? It's like it's hypothetical. It's not yet real, not yet realized. It isn't yet realized until he actually says, I shall resign. The modality fits in that sense. And then from then on, notice that you have all will. It's what will take place. Now, he is trying to communicate what? A sense of certainty. Then we notice that this I shall resign, paragraph 8. And it carries on then, will. And then again, paragraph 17. Again, shall. I shall leave this office. But one thing that was striking about this, the use of shall always seemed to signal an important, significant point in his speech. I shall resign. I shall leave this office. And notice something else. At that point, paragraph 17 onwards, there is, in this instance, no mention whatsoever up until he gets to the next shall. It completely we, us, and our. No first person. No I, me, or my. None in that whole block. What's interesting here is that this you can see a patterning that occurs, and you ask yourself then why that one block stands out differently than the rest of the text. And you'll remember that in that block, when he says, I shall leave office, as he's proceeding to talk, it's here that he's talking about his past accomplishments, what he did as president. He even smiles at one point. It's like a completely different set of circumstances, different occasion. And it's very marked in terms of the way it's using language. It's set off, I shall, and then from there on, it sets off a completely different focus to the speech, which he returns to then subsequently, and it's back to first person. The other point that I made was this was we, us, and our, any use of first person, singular or plural, but what was theme? What was theme was largely the circumstances. Remember we said theme is what you want to talk about. What does he want to talk about here? He wants to talk about the circumstances that framed the reason why he's resigning. The nature of the text, the nature of meaning is there in the choices that we make. And those choices are process, participant, circumstance, parataxis, hypotaxis, theme, modality. And in that speech, one of the points I made was how the use of theme played a role in being able to sort of see the coherent structuring of the text. Paragraph 3 ended peace in the world. Paragraph 4 from there on, 4 through 11 talk about what is that peace? This kind of logical progression, the use of but to indicate a sort of concession. Here, this has been the role in the past, but now. You're conceding that was the role we had. Now we have a new role, signaled again by the conjunction at the beginning of the clause, at the beginning of the paragraph. And then paragraph 6, 7, 8, we shall, that repetition, that gives it a sort of paratactic extension, one idea after the other, all of them elaborating on what is the nature of America's new role. What I'm trying to show you here and impress on you is how the choice of theme, whether it's linear, or whether it's a use of conjunction, or whether it's continuous, these choices define the coherent structuring of the text. And you'll remember when I talked about the architecture of the speech, and again, a similar point like what we noticed before in the earlier text of Nixon's that we looked at, there is this one block that again stands out. No, only one let us, when the rest of the text is constantly let us, let us, let us. Now that pattern, and I again mentioned this point, is not just patterning in the choices that you make, it's patterning in the choices that you don't make. Now, what was in that paragraph 3 through 11? Peace. And you'll remember what I mentioned to you last time, and that was that this was his second inaugural. 2 weeks later, they would announce peace with Vietnam. He knows that this is coming. He anticipates this. And that probably that part, again, was added later after the rest of the speech had been put together. That's why it has a different texture. The texture, the patterning that comes through the text. And that texture contributes to our sense of the coherent architecture of the speech. Language is the way that we create texts. And these texts, they can inspire. They can talk about innovation. They can motivate. They can be art. Sort of critical to the whole thing is our ability to de-automatize, to recognize this is water, and be able to recognize the default, recognize the automatic, and break out of that. That's the creativity. And we respond to creativity. We respond to that foregrounding. We respond to that de-automatization. I'm going to leave you with, as I told you the last time, this is, I'm retiring. This is my last lecture. I just wanted to leave you with something.
Too much to say, too much to lose. I get frustrated thinking about the world I brought you to. It's a battle of time that I have with you. We don't decide the how, the when, or if we make it through. I feel that you deserve a chance to know the truth and to be better than the ones who came before you, only to let pride and money weaken them. So be the young, the brave, the powerful, 'cause the world is standing waiting for someone to come and change it. Yeah, be the young, the brave, the powerful. 'Cause we need a soul to save us, need someone to be the greatest. So many words veiling the truth. The earth is turning and it's time for us to choose. And people will try to take you down too. But if I was a betting man, I'd put all my money on you. I know that I have nothing left to give to you to make you better than the man I failed to be, the friend and father that I know I should have been. So be the young, the brave, the powerful. 'Cause the world is standing waiting for someone to come and change it. Yeah, be the young, the brave, the powerful. 'Cause we need a soul to save us, need someone to be the greatest. Nobody knows what to say, nobody shows you the way. Sometimes it's hard to see who you're gonna be. So be the young, the brave, the powerful. 'Cause the world is standing waiting for someone to come and change it. Be the young, the brave, the powerful. 'Cause we need a soul to save us, need someone to be the greatest. Be the young, the brave, the powerful. 'Cause the world is standing waiting for someone to come and change it. Be the young, the brave, the powerful. 'Cause we need a soul to save us, need someone to be the greatest. Love.
So, thank you for joining this course. I hope that you got something out of it, and wish you well with your studies. Look forward to your term papers, and for those of you that will be on doing the exam on campus, I'll see you there. And for those of you that, to all of you, I'll say thank you and goodbye. So thank you very much. If you do have any questions along the way, please feel free to drop me an email or and be glad to try to respond. Okay, thank you.